second issue for them. I've been involved in the PACE program since I was a sophomore. So today, before the panel begins, I'll just outline the structure very quickly. So each of our panelists will speak for about 6 to 8 minutes. And our timekeeper is right here in the front, just to remind you guys. So they'll be addressing the question, what should be the role of the media and our responsibility when navigating it? So our first panelist is Elaine Monaghan. She is a professor of practice here at the Media School at IU. Our second panelist is Tom French, the Riley Endowed Chair in Journalism and also professor of practice here at the Media School at IU. And our third panelist is Wes Martin, the news director of WFHB Community Radio. And our fourth panelist was supposed to be Ryan Purick, but he came down with the flu, so he cannot make it. So with that, I will turn it over to Elaine, and she can begin.
Thanks. Okay, thanks for the introduction. I think I would like to start just by explaining what I am, because people hear the title Professor of Practice and they're like, does that mean you're practicing to be a professor? But what it actually means is...
Yes.
Yes. Tom is also one, so he understands what I'm saying. So the point about my title that's relevant in a way today is that I teach courses which examine the practice of journalism and of public relations also. So that's what I'm here to talk about. What do we mean by the ethical practice of journalism? So since we're trying to answer the question of what should be the role of the media and our responsibility when navigating it, that seems like a good place to start. What do we mean by the ethical practice of journalism? And nowadays, what also do we mean by the ethical consumption of journalism? Because now we're all able to broadcast our thoughts through social media, and we're able to interact with practitioners of journalism anytime we like, not always in a way that they might respond to, but that possibility is there in a way it wasn't for my generation when I was at your stage. So just to give you some context of my particular perspective on all of this, obviously I'm not from here, I'm from Scotland. The kind of journalism that I've practiced has been international journalism or foreign correspondence. And I came into that role because I had a great fascination with the idea of travelling around the world and getting to see up close big events. And so I guess that's the first job that we have as journalists, which is to tell everyone about things they can't necessarily themselves see up close. And I guess that's our first role, is to report and to shed light on things that are happening in as accurate and as quick and as beautiful a way as we can. So I think that's our first job. So in trying to sort of define this, I went back and looked at the handbook of my first employer as a journalist, which was Reuters. How many of you have heard of Reuters? Okay, how many of you have heard of Associated Press? Okay, all right. So Reuters is what I like to think of as the international version of Associated Press, although Americans will often tell you it's a British news agency because its main headquarters is in London. But we, did try to sort of look at the world from many different perspectives and in a global kind of way. So for me, that's another part of journalism practice, which is not just being able to reflect what's happening around you accurately, but also being able to go into other cultures and other countries and navigate what's happening there in a way that makes sense to an international audience. And of course, we often, fall down quite badly in that task because as finances have become tighter and tighter in newsrooms, we've started to shut down more and more international bureaus. And if you live in the United States, you really don't see very much international news, unfortunately. And what you see is often not terribly well done, usually because of a lack of time and a lack of resources. So that's where you, as the audience, often can come in, because one of the ways you can keep journalists honest is by pointing out to them when they've got something wrong. So you should use those opportunities, I would recommend, to talk to journalists and tell them if you spot something that you think doesn't accurately reflect the situation. And of course you can do that through comment boards, you can leave messages, even, you can interact with New York Times journalists nowadays online, and certainly on social media, you have opportunities to engage in conversations with journalists and about the news, and I really, would encourage everyone to do that as much as possible, because I think it enriches the conversation. Let me just see, how much time have I got? You're going to tell me to stop talking in a minute. I would say also that keeping in mind the three main values that I think journalism should have, which are accuracy, speed, and exclusivity. And what we mean by that is that our task is to find information that nobody else has, because that makes it more valuable. And that is the task that, as journalists, we have every day, and we're trying to pursue with as much relevance for our audience as we possibly can. So I think I'm going to stop there, because you're going to tell me to anyway, and pass it to my colleague, Tom.
Thanks, Elaine. I have been interested in being a reporter since I was 10 at Delaware Trail Elementary School in Indianapolis. I've been reporting ever since at my high school newspaper, Pike High School, here at IU as an undergrad, and then after graduating from IU, I went down to the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, and I reported on the full hallucinogenic range of experience that Florida embodies. Freeze-dried pets, alligators, murder trials, serial killers, college students carousing through spring break, all of it. If you're going to be a newspaper reporter, by the way, Florida is the best state in the country to do that. It's because it's the craziest state in the country. I left reporting in Florida and came to teach here. And my lifelong interest in reporting is specifically in what's called narrative journalism. I work on using strategies usually associated with fiction, scene, character, theme, and combine them with the factual foundation and factual rigor of journalism. So I tell true stories, and truly stories that unfold like a story. So what is the role of journalism? Well, one of them, I think, in narrative journalism is really a powerful tool for this, is to give voice to the voiceless, to write about people or to shine a light on people whose lives are not on the front page of most newspapers or on the nightly news, or people who don't have titles, people who have no power, people who have no money, people who are not celebrities. An awful lot of journalism is consumed by covering a very small percentage of humanity. My interest is in writing about the rest of humanity. I'm actually nervous interviewing people with titles. I have a problem with authority, and it kind of comes through. A lot of journalists actually are very nervous interviewing people who don't have titles. But that's the people I like to write about. I like to write about high school students, and I've actually spent a lot of time in the public schools, writing about everybody from preschool kids to high school. So I think that giving voice to the voiceless is crucial. To the invisible, to the marginalized. I think another huge role of journalism, and it's never been more clear in American history than it is right now, is to seek out the truth. Not an alternative truth, but the truth. There is no such thing as an alternative truth. There is the truth. And the truth is something worth fighting for. There are 3 IU trained journalists over the past century who gave their lives in pursuit of the truth. Most recently, Michael Ducille, a photographer who I worked with down at the IDS when I was here. He was a photographer at the Washington Post, 3-time Pulitzer winner. He died while covering the Ebola outbreak, the latest Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Ernie Pyle, who some of you may have seen his statue outside of Franklin Hall, gave his life covering World War II, along with the common infantry soldiers. And Don Mellett gave his life reporting on corruption in a small town in Ohio. He was assassinated in front of his house, died in the arms of his wife. So journalism believes, and journalists believe, that the truth is something that matters. And that is our job, and we're going to go after it every day, even if it means taking great risks. So that's kind of my take on the role of journalism. And I guess I would say that if you ask me what I hope what I think should be the audience's role, it should be to seek out the truth and to begin thinking hard about what is the truth and what is an opinion and what are outright lies. You know, there's been a bunch of outright lies in the last week or so perpetrated by some members of, I guess we call them, I wouldn't call them members of the media, but they're a bunch of liars is what they are. There have been a lot of lies published about some of these high school students down in Florida who are speaking up about guns and calling them actors, and it's nonsense. These are some of the same people, Alex Jones from InfoWars and so forth, who I don't understand why he's not in prison, actually. Alex Jones is one of the people who perpetrated the lie that Sandy Hook was, the Sandy Hook massacre was a fraud and never happened. And they have hounded those poor parents who lost their kids and called them liars and said they never had these children. That is an outrage, and that's the kind of thing that journalism should be going after and exposing. And my hope is that as an audience, you will help us. You will pay attention to what is a fact, what is a deeply reported fact, and what is a lie. That's I think, our job and yours. Thanks.
The question, what is the role of the media? I get deeply resentful of every time I hear the phrase, the media. I work for a nonprofit independent radio station, a community station that has been in operation in Bloomington for 25 years. And when people throw around a vague and unspecified term like the media, it is instantly politicizing, and it is instantly ostracizing. And it makes me angry to my core every time I am thrown in the same mix as somebody like Alex Jones. We're not the New York Times. We're not the Washington Post. We're not WBEZ in Chicago. We are a nonprofit. And if you thought journalism didn't pay, try working for a journalistic nonprofit. Nobody, I don't think, goes into journalism because they want to make a buck or because they want to make a name for themselves. They go into it because they see it as, I believe, fundamentally public service. I think ultimately what public service means, and what politicians in some cases have forgotten, is that you are a servant to the public. And as a journalist, the best way to serve the public is to tell complex stories about complex systems in a simple way. In a way that somebody, and this is the way that I tell everybody to report stories that walks through our door, your audience is turning left with a donut in one hand, not signaling, cell phone in the other, lighting a cigarette. They're going to catch every other word that you end up saying. So you have to say it simply, and you have to say it repeatedly. The basics, who, what, where, when, why, and how, are kind of not as important as the why. Why is this happening, and why does it matter to your audience? I would say those are the two biggest questions that you have the obligation to answer as a journalist. The way that you end up doing that, you have a number of tools at your disposal, particularly in this country. The First Amendment is an unbelievable piece of legislation. The Freedom of Information Act works on a federal level, and states also have open records acts and open records requests. There are things called two-party recording states. I think thankfully there's only about 8 of those. The vast majority of the time, when you are on the phone with anyone, they can be recording without your consent or without your prior knowledge. So keep that in mind as a journalist. This feels like a time to me. I came back to the States I would say December of 2016. And it was a very interesting time, and it's a very hostile time to be a journalist. And that means you have to cover your butt and make sure that what you're reporting is accurate. There is an adage, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. Your facts are being reported as facts, and as a public servant, you will be held accountable, and your organization will be held accountable for anything that you say or write or publish at any given time. The first thing that I do when somebody comes into my office is I Facebook them. I try to figure out what their presence is on social media. Where is this person coming from? What's their background? What are they broadcasting out to the world about themselves? That's something that is a very scary reality that we live in. Any 140-character sentence that you write can be called up. If it's on the internet, it's out there permanently. That means anything that you say now can be held against you in the future and can be held against your employer in the future. That means you need to clean up your presence immediately online. If you take nothing away from this panel, I would say go back over all of those stupid Facebook posts that you made in high school and get rid of all of them, or at least try to. Because that's the first thing that somebody's going to look for to discredit you. That's the way that an article that you researched for months gets thrown in the trash by character assassination. And you would like to think that your audience is smarter than that, and they're not. Because everybody has a soundbite memory. Everybody has the last thing that they wrote in their heads. And that's all that they have. And that defines the way that they're going to see you, the way that they're going to see your publication or your employer. Your brand is your name and what you broadcast out there. That means that your brand will be tied to any employer. And I have seen people get turned in and outside of doors really quickly because they were uncareful one night, or something came up in their past, or they wrote a really great investigative story, and all of a sudden, their employer and a corporate sponsor are gunning for them, and they're going to look for anything to do away with you, to discredit what you've written. I think Elaine mentioned telling truth to power is a big part of journalism. It's really hard to do that when your name is sullied. One of my friends is working at the Pensacola Times. One of my colleagues is working in Pensacola right now. And Florida Energy is on his butt because of what he's written. And that's a major difference between corporate media and independent journalism. He's facing a lot of heat and he's facing a lot of flack from his employer because Florida Energy, advertises. There's a dollar sign attached to that name. I am very lucky and very grateful every day that I go to work because I work for an independent nonprofit radio station, and it pays a pittance, but I get to have my voice, and I get to ultimately serve the public. And I think that is what we are trying to do. And I get to go to work with a clean conscience about I'm able to separate my own personal opinions and beliefs about a story and broadcast something that I think is truly independent and truly telling a complex system and unraveling that system in a simple way for a person that's turning left while lighting a cigarette and texting their mother and God knows what else. That's about it from me.
Let's give our panelists a round of applause. So we will now move into the question and answer portion of our panel. So you all had to come up with questions as part of your pre-form assignment, as well as anything that may have came up in your first session. So if you guys want to raise your hand, someone will be walking around with a microphone and she can bring that to you. You just just start at the back and work your way forward.
Okay. Well, I liked what all three of y'all said. I thought it was very, it pertains to what's going on right now. But my question would be, so us as college students, what can we do to be more involved and more updated in what's going on in the journalistic world? Because a lot of what we get is from social media or what we see that our friends repost or post online. So how do you think is the best way for us to stay involved and get correct and factual news?
Can I start? That's a really, really great question. What was your name? Morgan, thanks for asking that really good question. So, on the one hand, yes, social media is kind of a nightmare because it only shows you what it thinks you want to see. So you have to sort of fish. And there's lots, the answer to this question is obviously incredibly long because there are so many different places you can fish for information. So you have to be really selective in where you look. And that doesn't mean you should stop engaging in conversations on social media. We're all going to keep doing that because we like it, right? But at the same time, try to be selective. And you can do that on social media, but you can also do it by what you read. So I would really recommend stepping away from this as much as you can, but also using this intelligently. So, a lot of my Facebook feed is actually conversations between myself and other colleagues. It's also conversations between me and my friends complaining about something pointless, right? And as long as you're aware of that, you just have to keep track of it. You can use Twitter very, surgically. You can create for yourself. How many of you have ever created a Twitter list? Okay, make Twitter lists. So, what you do, let's just say, name any story you're interested in learning something about. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Anyone? Israel. Okay, there you go. So, decide, so what would you like to learn more about Israel?
Conflict with Palestine.
Okay, so the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you for picking a really easy one. So, I would start, you take maybe 3 or 4 people who you know are reliable sources. Okay, can you think of one?
Reuters.
Yes, Reuters. Well done. Okay, she said Reuters. All right, so let's say you decide to use Reuters as one of your reliable sources. Go to Reuters' website. Find the name of a reporter who is often, bylined on stories there. Follow that person on Twitter. And then look and see who else is writing stories like that and add them to your list of Twitter handles. And then follow what those people are writing because you've identified them as reliable sources. So that's one thing you can do on Twitter. And then just read good newspapers. Go out and look at, intelligent television. So, okay, BBC, bearing in mind it's British, so it comes from a particular perspective. BBC World, to give you a more international context. PBS in this country is fantastic. If you watch CNN, fine, it's entertaining, but look at CNNI as well to get a broader perspective. Read the newspapers. They might not always exist in paper, but they're still all there online. And yeah, I could go on, but I'm going to pass the mic.
Thank you. I actually rarely hold paper in my hands anymore. I get almost all my news on my phone. I get it by checking the New York Times site, 6-7 times a day, because there's so much news these days that I can wake up at 3 a.m. and there'll be some major revelation out of Washington, almost every night. And I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, read the Guardian, read the BBC site. Look for legitimate, hard reporting news organizations. They are not always going to tell you what you want to hear. In fact, a lot of the news that they're going to report is sometimes going to make you uncomfortable or angry. That's called life. And so I think, just recognizing legitimate news organizations and following them either straight through their sites or through Twitter or Facebook is a huge start. Just reading the occasional story that gets shared by a friend on Facebook, I do read a lot of really interesting stories that come my way through Facebook from friends, but my starting point is the sites. We have to, I mean, you guys should be paying much closer attention than I am, because a lot of the stuff that's happening right now is going to be on your backs much more than ours. Our country takes on, you know, they didn't just pass a tax bill for the rich. In fact, they didn't pass it for the rich. They passed it for the super rich. If you were merely rich, this tax bill, this tax cut didn't help you that much, for those of you in the room who are rich. But if you're super rich, then it really helps you. But the estimates are from non-partisan budget analysis groups that it's going to add, what, $1.5 trillion to the deficit in the next 20 years? Guess who's going to end up paying that? You guys. We're going to be in the nursing home by then. Yeah. Well, not you, Wes.
Oh, I'll still be kicking.
Yeah, Wes has got a few more years.
But you know, this news that's happening, it's going to affect you. Stuff that's happening with global warming, that's going to affect you and your children. Stuff that's happening with our public schools, that's going to affect you. Much more than Elaine and I. The future is in your hands, and so you've got to really, hopefully, are paying attention through legitimate news sources that can give you facts. Not alternative facts, but facts. Do the New York Times, the Washington Post still piss me off sometimes? Sure. Sometimes I think they're paying attention to the wrong things, or one of their columnists will say something I don't agree with. Again, that's life. That's okay to read opinions that I disagree with. But it has to start with a factual understanding of where we are in this country and in this world.
I just want to acknowledge the fact that Dr. Knapp has put together this phenomenal sheet about contacting your representatives. Does anybody know who their representative is in Bloomington? Okay. Does anybody know that the polling places have changed? All right, good job. Good. There is now one polling place for Indiana University, and it's at the Union. That is really important. Democrats are infamous at losing local elections because they don't work on the ground game, and because people care about national politics. I have given up about national politics because I can get as angry as I want, and I see people like the New York Times do really good investigative journalism day after day, and suddenly in the middle of a news cycle, it's kicked off by whatever latest shooting of an African-American man has happened. There's enough going on locally. And I would say if you want to be educated, you need to start reading the Herald Times. The Indiana Daily Student does a phenomenal job of covering issues in South Central Indiana and also what's going on in the legislature. The best way to get involved and to know what's going on is to watch and look for and listen to local media. They're not always going to get it right, but they're definitely going to try. And you're definitely going to be more informed than the next schmo who, just turned on the Washington Post and saw, Congress did nothing again. The city of Bloomington spent $225,000 to purchase an armored car.
A used armored car?
No, a brand new armored car. It's the Lenco Bearcat. There was a family, an African-American family, that was detained last weekend, responding when police responded to active shooter threats by a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old against a Fairview Elementary School student. That is the world that we live in, and that is the national conversation, but it's happening here. So follow local media, because the cultural zeitgeist also happens here. And I think a lot of local media have their finger to the pulse of that.
So questions? We might just keep it to one or two of your respondents so we can get through more questions. Do you have a question right here?
Also, when you ask your question, say your name and make sure you're holding the microphone close enough to your mouth so that everyone can hear the question.
I'm going to give it back to you.
Hi, my name is Peter. So, despite the 6 main media conglomerates that control essentially all of media, they're basically controlling what those media outlets publicize. whether it's like certain opinions or biases. So is there a way you guys think they could, is there like a solution to diminishing the bias that could be expressed by those 6 conglomerates?
Which 6 conglomerates are you talking about? Because the Washington Post ain't owned by no conglomerate. They're owned by Jeff Bezos.
There's like Comcast and Disney.
Okay, but the New York Times isn't owned by any conglomerate. The Washington Post is not owned by a conglomerate. Those are independent news organizations. And, you know, the conglomerates like Comcast, yeah, you got to be careful when there's huge global corporations owning the news, because it's hard for them to keep their corporate ambitions out of their news reporting. But there's a lot of good independent reporting out there. And you were right. I just double checked it. It was a new armored car. I was told that it was used, but it was new. They're ordering it from the manufacturer.
Yeah. Thanks for the on the spot fact.
Yeah, I did a little fact check.
Perfect.
I just issued a correction.
So actually, that's a good point. So I understand what you're saying, and I agree with Tom that, you know, the way you can decide whether your media outlet is a good source is partly to do with identifying what its financial situation is, but it's also about identifying what the sort of journalistic practices are at a given organisation. So, you know, I mean, at Reuters, for example, although that is a, you know, publicly traded company, it also has these things called the trust principles, which have been around for decades. Can't remember how many. But Reuters has been around a really long time, and it has like a publicly available handbook that, in which certain principles and rules are embodied that you can read and that you can fact check against what journalists are actually doing. So I would say that those kinds of like publicly available ethical principles can tell you a lot more about the source that you're looking at, so that you can make a decision for yourself on whether you want to trust it or not. And that, to get back to this question of what your responsibility is as a member of the audience, that's part of it, is to educate yourself, not just about the publication, but about the individual journalist that is writing or reporting or broadcasting inside that organisation, so that you can develop a sense of, yeah, these are people I want to listen to, or these are people I don't want to listen to. I'll shut up.
Sorry, I did have one more point. Sometimes those huge corporations, by the way, those individual reporters working inside that machine still produce some exceptional journalism. Like this whole issue with sexual misconduct and Olympic athletes and other gymnasts and others around the country. You know what news organization broke that? Who knows what news organization broke that story 2 years ago? Anybody? It was the Indy Star. Tim Evans, who's one of the best investigative reporters in the country, working at the Star, led a team of people to break that story. So, and the Indy Star is a part of Gannett, which is, of course, it is a huge conglomerate. But there's still some really good, important work coming out of there, too.
I would just say, watch out for op-eds. A lot of people end up sharing opinion editorial pieces and say, how can such and such publication publish this? This is obviously fake news. They don't understand that an opinion editorial is, or something penned by an editorial board, is a matter of opinion, and they get the right to that. Because the rest of that paper is not an opinion. That's fact. Also, I would say Haaretz, if you're looking for media about Israel-Palestine. They do a good job.
Hi, my name is Rebecca, and I want to ask about, like, when you're generating news content, how do you balance between what people want to know versus what they need to know? Or basically, what people are looking for versus what they don't even know what to look for?
A lot of the news that we put out is really boring. A lot of it is city council meetings or town council meetings about Ellettsville. A lot of it is who said what in the state legislature. What crazy bill has our legislature concocted this session? So that is not terribly sexy in terms of journalism, right? Things like an armored car or an African-American family being detained, those things are terrible when they happen, but they make for good news. And ultimately, you're a public servant, so you have to decide. Nobody's going to decide that for you. Maybe an editor will, but I think the way of the newsroom is dying. I think largely people like Reuters and Associated Press, they're largely sustained by contributors and independent contributors. So if you want to be a journalist somewhere, if you want to report on Israel-Palestine or a drought in Malawi, go there. Just go and start reporting on what it is that you have. That's how you build a brand and build credibility.
Wait, sorry. You're not suggesting that we all can go to Malawi or wherever the next thing is we want to learn about. You're saying follow journalists who are willing to do that, right?
I'm saying yes, do both.
But there's news breaking out all over the world right now. How can we go to, personally, each of us go to each place in the world right now?
I don't think you have to. I think that if you have something you want to cover, like the Israel-Palestine conflict, go to Ramallah, go to East Jerusalem, figure out what's going on there. Talk to somebody that hasn't been talked to yet. I would say everybody interviews the Jerusalem mayor, right? Nobody is talking to the shop owner in the Armenian quarter, right? About what it means that the U.S. is moving their embassy there. There are stories out there, and it's your job to go get them.
I thought that was our job.
Oh, well.
Or their job, okay.
I'm assuming everyone's a journalist.
Is that true? How many people in this room are interested in being journalists? Yeah, I didn't think most.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Okay. Do they still?
Well, are the rest of you public relations?
We're all different stuff.
Okay.
Do we still have to all go to Malawi?
Whoever raised your hands, go to Malawi.
No, but I mean, certainly reporters should go to places where other reporters aren't going and interview people who aren't being interviewed. I think that's unquestionable.
How many more people have questions? Because I don't want to start going on if there's lots of questions. Oh, there's a few. So,
My name is Justin Freeman, and I guess a little backstory to it. I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm a freshman here though, but while I was a junior and senior in high school, I got really involved in my community, led me to be recognized for a few different things. Fast forward to being here in Bloomington, I joined this organization called Seek. We had a really nice event when we had a popular person come to the event. And so throughout the course of me being in high school, my junior and senior years, and me going to different programs and stuff and being recognized, whether it's being a speaker, being awarded, or coming here and having that really big event, I had numerous interactions with local media. And I was wondering, because sometimes I'll be interviewed after the event, and I know how the interview went, and then, I was never in a bad light when I seen it on TV, but they took 15 and 20 minutes and boiled it down to 2 or 3 minutes. Or like the article that was about the event that my organization hosted here at IU. They're misspellings, position titles weren't accurate, or how we told them what we do, or how we do it. Things were just it wasn't a bad light shed on us, but it still wasn't accurate. It didn't resemble what I felt like was showing the true story of the event, or what I did, or what the event was about, things of that nature. So I was wondering, how could us as a public, and especially people with first-hand experiences like that, empirical, experiences like that, how can we build our trust in the media, or, trust that they're serving the public if we have an interaction, even at a local level, that we don't feel like is being represented accurately, even if you reach out to the person who covered it and said, oh, I seen this mistake, and you go a week or 2 later, and it's still not fixed. How can we keep our trust in the media and the trust that they're serving the public?
I'll quickly just make a couple of suggestions. Which publication was it, if I may ask?
For Bloomington, it was IDS. Back in Fort Wayne, we have WFHB Fox local, and then we have Wayne 15.
Right. I mean, just generally speaking, I would say most responsible outlets have a way to ask for a correction. And I must confess, I'm not sure about the IDS's process.
They do.
But IDS has a correction process, which Tom could tell you more about. Certainly, if you're not getting satisfaction from the journalist, that's probably what you need to do is contact the newsroom. And any responsible media outlet will, in fact, have that information publicly available. And outlets that do not correct their errors are not worth following. Just don't read them, ignore them. As far as what you can do to prevent that sort of thing from happening, I mean that's a whole other world of public relations, and Ryan is a practitioner of that, and he's not here. However, I've done a bit of that too, and I teach some of that. And I would say to you that if you're ever going to interact with a journalist, first of all, give them the information they need so they don't make mistakes. How do you do that? Give them a press release, write it down, give them the facts on paper, because that way they won't make those, they're less likely to make those kinds of mistakes. And sort of have an idea of what message you want to give them and deliver that message clearly to them, and that will help diminish those kinds of problems. But more broadly speaking, in terms of audience trust in the media, I mean, we all know and understand that that is an endemic problem, and we could talk about that for years and still not resolve it. But I think the more that you as audience members and we as well as practitioners can be involved in a conversation with each other that attempts to address some of these problems, the greater that trust will become. And fortunately, there are ways to build trust now that weren't there before, including interactivity through social media. But yeah, you have to pick up the phone. Call the newsroom, tell them they made a mistake, and ask them to correct it. Tom.
Well said.
Thank you.
I, of course, have made mistakes. Tom
I just made.
has never made mistakes. But these things happen, and a large percentage of the time, I would say, nothing is done maliciously. Nobody's trying to get names wrong. Nobody's trying to make somebody look less than what they are in terms of writing a story. Journalists have really tight turnarounds for deadline, and sometimes it's unfortunate, but sometimes things fall through the cracks. The best thing you could do is just call whatever station it was or whatever publication it is and say, hey, I was the subject of an interview earlier and they spelled my name wrong or they got something about our organization incorrect. And I just wanted to make that known to an editor. And Elaine's right. Anybody who doesn't go back and make that change is not worth your time. I would also say that, well, that's it.
My name is Claire, and I just wanted to know, this is kind of a different topic, but I wanted to know how, if any, you think the 2016 election influenced or changed the media's role in our society, and if you think that this shift in their role is permanent. Yeah.
Go on, Tom. That's one for you.
Well, the president says that he's at war with the media. He says that reporters are the enemies of the people. Y'all know who first came up with that phrase, enemies of the people, right? Or popularized it back in the 50s and 40s. Anyone know? Stalin. So I guess that's who we are, as enemies of the people. And it's interesting because when there was an interview with Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, he said, we're not at war with the administration. We're just trying to cover the facts. And I think that mission is not going to change. But when you are constantly under attack every day by an administration that makes not just little errors, but big factual misstatements every day, several of them usually. I mean, there's people, the Washington Post knows they're keeping track of it. Guess what? They don't issue corrections. Okay? We do. We're trying to get it right. They are engaged in propaganda. Now, if you agree with their political aims, then that is propaganda toward a good direction. But either way, there is something that they're trying to get done, and they feel that the reporting of the media and the reporters is getting in the way. But we're not at war with them. They're at war with us. And we're going to keep reporting the truth.
I would just say the administration has an agenda. They're going to stick to that. Regardless, journalists have to keep doing their jobs. You are as a consumer of media, you vote with every click. Every time you open an article, you are telling that publication what is worthy of their time and their limited staff. If it's listicles of cats and memes, then that's you're going to see more of it. But if it's an investigative piece about the Panama Papers, or most recently the Bermuda Papers, then you're going to get more of that. You vote with every click, every dollar, the time you spend on a screen. All of this is a metric data that companies can use to figure out what works, what is our audience interested in. And they're very interested in their audience. It's who they are.
Do you want to ask another question?
Hi there, my name is Nova, and I was wondering what's the best way to inform people who are either misinformed or uninformed without necessarily pushing my political opinion on them.
You mean you as a participant in social media, or you just as a human in general, or?
I guess specifically in social media, as that's kind of the easiest way for me to present information to people en masse.
So I guess, thinking about Facebook, shall we start with that? Do you use Facebook? Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
So, I mean, you have an opportunity to correct other people's mistakes on Facebook, right? So, the crazy article that your Uncle Johnny shared, and it's just bananas, and it's wrong, right? You can just politely tell him, hey, Uncle Johnny, you might want to take that down, because that article's a year old and it's wrong. Okay, so that's one thing you could do. So you could sort of play a fact-checker role, which is actually something that journalism is increasingly doing and has always tried to do, but we're doing it in very specific ways now. But you as a member of the audience can also do that. In terms of sharing information, I mean, I suppose some of the basic principles of journalistic writing are to do, you could employ those. So brevity, clarity, using words of 3 syllables or fewer, not using jargon, not expressing yourself in words that might not be comprehensible to a large chunk of the people who would read it. If you're really trying to build an audience, make a blog. Do you have a blog?
I mean, I'm semi-famous on Tumblr, but I'm not sure if
Tumblr counts. So, I mean, I think the point is that because we've all got access to these ways of publishing ourselves, it's all the more important to follow rules that are sort of recognisable to most people who care about these things. And actually, I didn't read this to you, but I sent to Professor Napoli 1 page of this book, which I think of as the sort of Bible of journalism, called The Elements of Journalism. And there's a page in here called The 10 Elements of Journalism. And if you follow those, then you'll be doing a good job.
That's like the 10 Commandments of journalism. She's right, it's really good. One other thing I would say is really important for all of us is it's very, very easy now for us, because the political discourse has become so estranged. It is very easy for us to demonize one another. I would really personally recommend we try to do our best to avoid that, all of us, because I don't think you change anyone's mind by demonizing them or by yelling at them. I think you try to talk to them and communicate with them calmly. But that's my humble opinion.
Just to piggyback on that, I don't see any point in arguing with a bigot. You're not going to change somebody's mind when they're not open to change. Have conversations with people who listen, and avoid comment sections. And I would also say, when you're reading and trying to inform yourself, stay away from any article that uses adjectives or adverbs about people, or it's just generally kind of a red flag to me. Anything that uses valuative statements about what it is that they're reporting on, we really just want the facts. And anything else starts to get into a gray territory between a blog, a propaganda machine, and something more sinister.
So in today's era of what they're calling the fake news era, a lot of what the public opinion is that more people can trust not-for-profits over news sources like CNN and Fox. And a big part of that is the way that headlines are presented to us on social media. I wanted to know what your opinion is on the way that headlines are posted, and things like just last week with the Parkland shooting and things like that. There's a lot of controversy over, again, this kind of value added headlines. So I just wanted to hear your opinions.
That's a really good question, honestly. A lot of times social media managers are not editors. So what you see on social media, unless it's a wire service like AP or Reuters, a lot of times the headline of the article isn't the same as what you see on social media. In order to get kind of a direct feed, you have to go to the website. Because a lot of that, again, is social media management. And social media management is a tool for a lot of these companies to generate more visitations. I wouldn't necessarily say that a nonprofit station is automatically more trustworthy. In many cases, it's the exact opposite. I generally get mad at broadcast media, which I am a member of, but our colleagues in television generally can make some pretty poor editorial choices because it's about keeping people glued to the TV, keeping people watching so that advertisement goes up and so that they get a metric boost, right? So if the more shocking a statement is, right? Also be really aware that of any media that ends up saying, a teacher touching children, is that happening at your school? We'll find out after this break, right? It's purposefully cliffhangery because they want you to stay tuned, to stay glued. Stay away from any outlet that you see doing that.
I would just quickly add to that. So if you're trying to decide whether a headline is worth clicking on or reading, like Wes was saying, you have to go to the original article in order to be able to make an assessment of the headline. And it's definitely true that a lot of social media management is not necessarily being done by the people who have generated the stories. You as a reader can absolutely check to see if the headline matches the content of the story. Because sometimes what's happening, for example, the New York Times is very good at pulling out really fantastic little bits of thread from a story that are just so amazingly interesting that you absolutely have to click on it and read it. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, we have to be like 5 million% better at that because we're trying to stand head and shoulders above, the crap all around us. So, but the good news is that you can actually check and see, does the headline match the facts in the story? If it doesn't, discard it immediately and wish that you could unclick, but you can't. Anyway, yes.
So do you think that social media management is kind of taking away from that mission of the clear, honest truth?
I mean, the answer to that is extremely long. It shouldn't. It often does, but it really, again, it's exactly the same principles as it is in any other aspect of journalism, that it really depends on the person and the organisation that's created that headline and what their mission is. So you need to know what their mission is in order to be able to make that assessment. I don't know if that answers your question. Tom, do you want to say?
You do great.
Hi, my name is Matt. The question I have for you guys is, what responsibility do you think the reporters and the news media has on reporting objectively? Because I believe the problem today with today's media is more the misleading than the factual, that's it is factually correct or not. So what responsibility do you think the media has to report objectively?
Do you have an example of the story you're thinking of, the way it was reported, being misleading?
Common examples are on how certain news sources like the CNNs, NBCs, and the Fox News of the world will push a certain bias or perspective on they'll push a certain bias or perspective. Like, I'll see 3 different news headlines, and one will make it seem like one thing going on is worse than it actually, or more relevant than it actually is. Or I'm just talking about the bias that goes on in news media and how that can be stopped by talking more objectively. What do you have to say about that?
I tried to get Elaine to go for that one.
It's all yours, Tom.
There's a lot of really complicated terms in your question. One of them is the word objectivity. That is a scientific value that is actually impossible. It is impossible for us to remove every bias that we have grown up with. I mean, for instance, in this country, we have an inherent belief that's kind of drilled into us early on that our country is exceptional. That's bullshit. Our country is a country. It's full of good people and people who aren't so good, and we've made mistakes like every other. We've got wonderful things we've done, and we've got difficult things, and but we're raised with this bias that America is just, we have a pro-America bias, which leads us all to sometimes not want to think too hard about things that we've done in our history and are doing right now that are quite problematic, or sometimes just flat out immoral. So we all have biases. The question is, I really think, if you were one of my students, we'd be talking about this a lot in class, is like, how do you figure out what your biases are and try to essentially neutralize them so that you can report as fairly and objectively as possible. But I would say, unless we're machines, it's impossible to eliminate all bias. But if you're talking about Fox News or some other outlets, the bias is very pronounced, I think. And that I'm very nervous about. Now, there's other countries in the world where the journalistic traditions are, including, England, where that's the way the publications are organized. This is a left-wing newspaper, this is a right-wing, and the readers just kind of factor that in. And that's considered, in those countries, a good thing. But in this country, we try our best, most of us, to eliminate those biases and to be aware of them. So, for instance, a little one, I already said it, I wasn't joking that I have a problem with authority. Well, that means that I have an automatic attitude about principals. So, and I report a lot in the schools. So I have to be aware of that going into a school, that I've got the teenage version of myself is like, I'm the kid in the back of the room who wants to go, bullshit, all the time. I'm still got that immature kid there. And that's important, because if I'm going to report inside a public school, there's really good principals out there, and there's some that aren't that good. And I just need to evaluate this principal on the basis of how they actually are, not whatever I went through with Mr. Chavone back in Pike High School in the 70s, because that's irrelevant. So I'm giving you a long answer because it's a really complicated question. Yes, we need to do our best, I believe, to understand those biases and to root them out of our work. But one of the biases that we had a problem with in journalism for a long time, and I think we're finally making some progress on it, is that we had a bias toward a false dichotomy. We used to believe we reported what this side said and what that side said. And we didn't try to evaluate the accuracy or the truthfulness of what they're saying. And that all came to a halt in the, what was Carrion Bush? What year was that?
2000, which Bush?
Carrion and W.
Oh, what, 4?
Yeah, in the 04 election, in the August leading up to that election, this group called the Swift Boat Veterans accused John Kerry, who's a hero, a decorated military hero, of lying about his record and of being serving on a swift boat. They were lying, but we, the media, did not do a good job of shutting down those lies immediately, and that dominated the national conversation for a couple of weeks. That was a mistake, and that was really one of the key factors that led to what Elaine was talking about, this incredible proliferation now of fact-checking. Because now, if whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, if one of our leaders says something and it is not true, I think most reporters agree we need to say that. And we were much more reluctant to say that maybe 20 years ago. I think it's really important that our bias be for the truth and not for just representing both sides as sort of being equal holders of the truth, because that just ain't true sometimes.
Nothing to add.
I would just say stop watching and start reading. A lot of the nightly news that you end up seeing, particularly on television broadcast, they're interviewing people with controversial opinions, ones that you may or may not agree with. They're airing those opinions because those people get to say those. And it's not always the truth, and it's not always accurate, and sometimes it's outright lies. The way to avoid that and the way to get a better perception of the truth behind an issue is to start reading articles about that. And don't listen to talking heads. I mean, the band is great, but don't listen to mouthpieces and spokesmen and think that they're going to give you an idea of the truth. They represent an interest, which is why they're on the television.
Sorry, what was your name again?
My name's
Matt? One of the things that's interesting is there's a bias that we all have, including all in this room. It's called confirmation bias. And if you read up on that, all of us tend to want to believe stories or news reports that match something we already hold to be true. And that is actually a really interesting problem. It's very complicated. I'm not a social scientist, or I could give you like a 3-hour speech on how we deal with that. But we have to be aware of my own and yours, our confirmation bias as well. It's a really, actually quite complicated issue.
Hi, my name is Dan Valstein, and I'm just wondering how you think the 24-hour news cycle that has kind of developed and now been more and more of a thing, since I was born, has changed how we look at different stories. For example, with the Las Vegas shooting or with the Parkland shooting, like the Vegas shooting, we heard about it on the news pretty much immediately, and they would show images of the actual scene days after, but a couple months later, we still don't know what happened. How do you think kind of the idea of having something so tragic on the national screen at national attention has kind of changed how news networks and news stories in general go from reporting about what happened tragically to actually finding out the facts and continuing to talk about that story and not get caught up in some other story that isn't remotely relevant afterwards?
One thing that I will say to address your question is that the news cycle has always been 24 hours. The news never stops. There's always something happening on the other side of the world. There's always something happening at night. Every time you hear a squad car go by, or an ambulance, or a fire truck, or anything, the news is always 24 hours. So that hasn't changed. I would say in terms of being responsible with your coverage, and you used Las Vegas shooting, I'm going to use something that is also tragic, but I think a little bit more humorous, is the Malaysian Airlines that just disappeared, and there was nothing on CNN for an entire week except for MH370 for an entire week. At what point does that stop serving the public interest and just become morbidly obsessed? One thing that I'm seeing as a national trend in news is to stop publicizing the names of people who commit school shootings, because they end up being an example and set that up for copycats. I think that's a very responsible editorial decision that has been made in light of what you're talking about, which is this constant coverage.
Yeah. So this is actually a debate that's happening within journalism, this question of whether you name shooters. I think, I might slightly disagree with you, Wes. It's our job to name them, I think. To come back to your 24-hour news question, I completely agree with you, Wes, that the news never stops. The way that we deliver our news and the deadlines vary according to the type of media organisation. The real question in my mind for you as a member of the audience is that when you're watching or consuming a moving news story, you have to understand that it's what we call the first draft of history. So it's going to have the faster moving it is, the more mistakes it will have in it, and the more misleading it will become. So that, to me, is when you really have to switch off the television, even though it's so tempting to watch it, because it's like catnip. We don't want to let go of it because it keeps you watching. You want to see what's going to happen next. But you can watch CNN or any other news on television for 8 hours, and you get to the end of it, and actually you don't know any more than you did 8 hours ago. So I would really encourage you to try to consume news, particularly in moments like that, where people have had a little bit of time to reflect, or to only follow news that is presenting the facts as they emerge. So I'll give you an example. So when that story broke a few weeks ago that somebody had fired a missile from North Korea in the direction of Hawaii, and everybody was running to the shelters, we were all, friends and I were on text kind of going, oh my God, is this true? And I said, well, is it on Reuters? And it wasn't. And the reason was that Reuters has a policy of not publishing stuff like that until they've checked. So they went and checked, and they realised it wasn't correct, so they didn't run the story. So I know I sound like I'm just, speaking up for Reuters, and that's because I know their newsroom policies, and there are lots of other news organisations that follow similar rules. So anyway, that's my response.
One more quick note. It's interesting because I think one of the effects of the 24-hour news cycle is it makes us believe falsely that all information is available immediately on everything. And that is not true. Most news events of any complexity, it actually takes years for a much more nuanced, detailed, accurate account of the truth to emerge. So, for instance, the shuttle Challenger explosion, when was that, 87?
Yeah.
Okay, so in 1987, the Challenger explodes. I was in St. Pete, Florida at the time. School kids all over the country were watching because that school teacher was on there. And one of the things that NASA put out that day and the days that followed was that the deaths of the astronauts had been instantaneous, because there were a whole thing about how fast an explosion rips through space and how fast your nerve endings work. And they just said they didn't feel anything. It was instantaneous. That turns out to not be true, unfortunately. Reports have just come out now, released by NASA, about some of the recordings from inside the cabin. And people were alive and breathing as that cabin fell down to the ocean below. And there's actually not dialogue, but one of the astronauts was heard to say on the transcript, "Uh-oh," right before it exploded. So NASA's official version, which I'm sure I understand they were trying to lie, but it takes time for the truth to emerge, for the real complexity of the truth. And we are doing our best to try to get it right. And I really respect that Reuters has that policy that we're not going to put it out there until they're sure it's right. But it's quite a complicated task.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. That's okay.
This feels wrong. I shouldn't be taking the last question, but I think I'm a very good question for you. I just want to get to Tom's point about Alex Jones, and he said, why isn't he in prison? And so this is kind of a two-part question. Wondering, aren't there libel laws and to try to police the really bad actors, the real liars, and why aren't those kind of enforced more? And the second part of the question is kind of similarly, aren't there, to get to sort of some of Elaine's point, there are professional ethical codes in journalism. What if any, mechanisms are there to enforce professional ethical codes to police the bad actors?
Can I take the first one real quick? When I said prison, I wasn't talking about a libel case or a slander case, which I think he was sued for, was it invasion of privacy?
I'll check.
I don't want to get another one wrong. And he had to back away a little bit from his Sandy Hook conspiracy bullshit. In which during the deposition he said, "I'm an actor. I'm not a journalist, and everyone knows that." That is bullshit, because he was one of the people responsible for that guy showing up with the automatic weapon at the pizza place in D.C., where he and others were saying that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of that pizza place, which was just not true. But the guy with the automatic weapon who was listening to Alex Jones didn't know that. So some of the stuff that he's doing, to me, it falls under fraud. I'm not a criminal prosecutor, but I don't understand how you can perpetrate violent lies that lead to violence about private citizens and not pay a serious price. In terms of the mechanisms for calling bad actors to account, you want to jump on that one, Max?
I just want to say that I'm very thankful that it's difficult. Libel and slander tort is really difficult to prove. They have to have a malicious intent. And so when you get into litigation, it becomes very difficult to prove that. I, for one, am very thankful to be a journalist where it's difficult to say, oh, this person got this fact wrong. They're obviously trying to disparage me or my organization. They belong in prison. That's how we move towards an autocracy. And I'm very thankful that people like Alex Jones get to say whatever it is that they want. They get that First Amendment right just like the rest of us.
Maybe I'll address your question about the ethical codes and the enforcement of them. Again, it sort of depends on the organisation, right? So at Reuters, I had a colleague who was fired because he changed a quote. One quote. The content of it. And it wasn't even deliberate, it was an accident, and he was gone. So, you've got everything from that end of the extreme to people who manage to kind of get by making stuff up and they don't get caught for ages, and there are cases like that, particularly the Jason Blair case at the New York Times, where he published numerous articles where he'd faked the fact, for example, that he was in West Virginia interviewing the family of Jessica Lynch, the soldier who was hurt and captured in Iraq. Well, held in Iraq. That's a long story. Anyway, so the point being that it really sort of depends on how, rigorously the given media organisations decide to enforce their own codes of ethics. So they might have them, but whether they're enforcing them or not is another question. And it's not like there's a legal requirement that they be enforced. It's not like the Hippocratic oath that a doctor takes. It's sort of self-enforcing. So, and for the reasons that Wes just described, I guess we have to be grateful for that. And at the same time, as journalists, obviously, I would never want to work in a place where those kinds of rules weren't enforced. But the truth is that they're not in a lot of places, and that's where the audience, ethically practicing audience members, come in, trying to shed light on those moments. Tom?
So, I don't think what I'm suggesting does lead to autocracy. I don't think journalists and the First Amendment does protect all speech. It does not protect inciting violence against private citizens. It does not protect threatening violence against private citizens. It would be a crime for us to sit up here and even make a joke about harming a public official. And I mean, I've written stories about people who thought they were joking and they made a joke like that, and then the FBI showed up at their door. And so we don't have unlimited freedom of speech, and journalists have to exercise to be aware of those limits. And Alex Jones, what he does, he's not a journalist, but what he does is a classic definition of what they call malice, which is the term Wes was talking about. And he doesn't even need to, we wouldn't even need to prove malice against him because he's making these statements about private citizens, not public officials. So I don't want autocracy, but I don't think it's right that people should be allowed to hurt people like the parents of the Sandy Hook victims.
Just to jump in, that's a really good point. There's a difference between private citizenry and being a public figure. So Nicki Minaj is a public figure, right? So if you tweet something hateful at Nicki Minaj, it becomes much more difficult to prove in legislation and in tort that you have been libelous or slanderous, because this person, we have a reasonable expectation that they are in the public eye and acting as a public figure.
I would not recommend critiquing Nicki Minaj because, I mean, she's going to come back at you really good and just...
Their army of Twitter,
like, there's
Twitter
some
followers.
people, if you insult them, they're really good at giving it back better than they got. She's one, Bob Dylan's another. That's what my sons and I have several life rules, only got 2 of them. One of them is never hit a cop, because it never goes well. Another is, not that I've done it, I've written about people who've done it, but another is, never piss off Bob Dylan. And I think because he's going to write a great song,
it's going to be terrible,
putting you down for the rest of eternity, people are going to be singing about you. I think the same is true with Nicki Minaj. So let's just agree, journalistically, we're not, or as personal citizens, we're not going to insult Nicki or Bob.
She's off limits.
If you guys just wanted to give us some closing thoughts as we...
That's as good as I got.
Yeah, I can't follow Nicki Minaj. I'm sorry.
All right, well, can we give a round of applause for our panel?
She's pretty good.